All right, so good morning. Welcome, everyone. I am Carmen Rodríguez-Peralta. I'm chair of music department here and director of a World of Music concert series and a pianist. And my colleague here, Orlando Cela, wonderful flutist and conductor, teaches a variety of courses here at Middlesex as well. So we're looking forward to taking you on a brief Peruvian sojourn or journey. And to help with this, we're going to start with a geography lesson. So here's the geography lesson. And please come on in. So Peru, of course, is part of South America. And its neighbors are Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile to the south, and then to the west is the Pacific Ocean. So the most important empire from long ago, of course, was the Inca Empire. And it was very, very vast. It extended from today, which is Colombia, through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, into Chile. The capital was Cusco, which is today in Peru, it's in the mountains of Peru. And the language was Quechua, which is still spoken by the indigenous people today. In fact, the word Cusco is a Quechua word, Cusco, which means belly button, meaning that Cusco was the center of the Inca Empire. The Incans were renowned for their spectacular palaces and temples and buildings where massive stones were fit together perfectly without using mortar. Probably the most famous Inca site is Machu Picchu. So if we could have the next one. Isn't that beautiful? I highly recommend you all go visit Machu Picchu. It's really, really spectacular. And if you would walk around and take a look at the ruins there, you can see how these stones are so perfectly fit together, and also how complicated and complex the architecture is. So Machu Picchu, there are two Quechua words. Machu means old, Picchu means mountain peak. And Machu Picchu is very near Cusco. It's a little bit lower in altitude than Cusco. Cusco is 11,000 feet above sea level, and this is 8,000 feet. But it's still pretty high, so you can't run. I would not recommend running in Machu Picchu, but absolutely spectacular, wonderful place to visit. So also, I don't know if you can see a little bit of the terraces there. That's where they planted their crops. So it was a combination of a city with wonderful buildings, and also they had everything set up for them to live there and to plant their crops. The next photo is a close-up of an Inca stone. This is actually in Cusco, 12-sided stone. It's 5 feet tall, it's massive, and somehow it was cut perfectly and fits perfectly in this wall without the use of any kind of mortar. And we're not really sure how they got the stones up there because the Inca did not have the wheel, so somehow they brought these stones from the quarries, which weren't actually that close by, and fit them perfectly into the stone. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. Interesting too that a lot of the Inca structures still remain standing even when there are earthquakes, and a lot of the Spanish structures, of course, have fallen down, but the original ones are still here. So this wall has survived numerous earthquakes, and it's still standing as we see it today. So the Incas also built over 10,000 miles of roads so to connect Cusco to the rest of the empire. And they also engineered functioning bridges and even built an aqueduct or several aqueducts to transport water. They are renowned also for their beautiful pottery and excelled in the decorative arts. There's wonderful textiles, beautiful designs, and very colorful. This comes from Peru, I wore. It doesn't have any designs, but it's made of alpaca. So very bright colors. The original ones had intricate designs. And they also had these beautiful masks, very elaborate masks of gold and silver. So the next picture that you're going to see is an open market in Chinchero. Chinchero is a small town near Cusco. This was taken about 5 years ago, so obviously it's modern, but you can kind of see the beautiful textiles, the different colors, the designs. And a lot of the indigenous people use the same traditions from hundreds of years ago. So these traditions of how to build the loom, how to dye the fabric has been passed down from generation to generation. So some of the tourists, buy things that are made by machine, but you can still find textiles made by hand in the old-fashioned way that had been done for hundreds of years. So the Inca Empire was vast. It was very important. It excelled in engineering and in mathematics. It had all these wonderful contributions in the arts. However, of course, as we know, it was eventually conquered by the Spaniards. The first Spanish conquistador, or conqueror, came to Peru in 1526, and he landed in the northern city of Tumbes, and he was completely amazed by what he saw. He was particularly impressed by the vast amounts of gold and silver. So he sailed back to Spain and asked the monarchs for permission to conquer the region which is now Peru and colonize it. Obviously, the monarchs gave him permission. So he returned in 1532, and after the Battle of Cajamarca, he managed to capture, he and 150 men, captured Atahualpa, who was the emperor at the time. Now you may wonder, how is it possible that Pizarro and 150 men could conquer the emperor of this vast and important empire? And there are two reasons. Number one was the smallpox epidemic, and number two was a civil war. So as you probably know, the Europeans brought smallpox to the New World, and smallpox had arrived to Peru even before Pizarro arrived there. But by 1532, when Pizarro returned to Peru, the indigenous population had been decimated by smallpox. And in fact, the previous ruler, Huayna Capac, his name's on your list there, Huayna Capac had been killed or had died from smallpox. And his two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, were fighting over who would get to control this empire. So the combination of a smallpox epidemic and the civil war that was going on in Peru made it possible for these very few men to conquer the entire Inca Empire. So by 1533, Cusco was overrun, Atahualpa was executed, and the Viceroyalty of Peru was established. And the Viceroyalty of Peru made up most of South America, except for Brazil. And the capital of this was not Cusco, but moved to the coast, and the capital was Lima. So gone was the importance of the mountains. The important cities were on the coast, like Lima, which was on the coast. Amazingly, independence didn't happen until 1821. So imagine, from 1530s to 1821, this vast region was under Spanish control. And the Independence Day is July 28th, in case you're interested. And by that time, by 1821, the countries that we know of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, etc., were more or less established and pretty much had the boundaries that we know today. Any questions? It's a lot of history, kind of quickly. Anybody would have any questions about the Inca Empire or anything Machu Picchu? Anybody here ever traveled to Machu Picchu? No. Your next trip, right? If you do want to go, though, you have to register online months in advance. When I went as a kid, you just showed up, you could walk around. That's not true anymore. You have to register, and you have to have they give you certain paths. You can't just wander, because they want to preserve this. Millions of people have come to see Machu Picchu. So it's one of the 7 wonders of the world. So it's really, really worth seeing. All right, so we talked a little bit about the empire, now a little bit about the music. Of course, the Incas had a rich musical tradition that was passed down by rote. So dances, melodies, rhythms for religious ceremonies, for secular events were passed down from generation to generation. Unlike most pre-Columbian civilizations, which favored voice and percussion, the two most important instruments in the Inca civilization were two flute-like instruments, the quena and the antar. So my colleagues will talk a little bit about these two instruments.
Yeah, so here we have both of them, and quenas and antaras come in very different sizes, and shapes. So one of the things that you notice is that this is a very, very simple instrument all throughout. There is nothing complicated about it. It's just tubes and holes. That's it. There's no moving parts. There is nothing such as strings attached or a group of strings attached. The string instruments come with the Spanish influence later on. But earlier, pre-Columbian is very simple. You have a tube and you have holes that are in a certain distance. And we know now through from studies and archaeology that they found out that the certain distance of the holes make for what we call today the diatonic scale. It's almost like you have only the white notes in the piano, and with that you get a certain style of music. And then the quena is hard to play because it's really a hollow tube, right? And it just has a little indentation here that is now referred to in English as the reed, right? And you kind of like aim it. As you can see, I don't play piano, right? So, but as you can see, once you get the sound, right? You get a certain amount of pitches that are very simple and they're very, very far away from each other, right? One of the things that also the quena allows for, because it's very unstable, you get to vary the pitch a little bit, right? The antaras come in many shapes and many sizes, and it's typical actually to have choruses of this one. So you have them from like these little ones to this little tall one over here, and we're gonna demonstrate. And again, this is also, you know, one of the cousins of the pan flute, right? While the pan flute, the Romanian pan flute, it's one line. This actually has two lines of tubes, right? So it makes for it makes, again, for just one note per pitch, but one of the cool things that you can do is actually you can get sometimes two pitches. Right? And again, a lot of it is not a lot of scales, chromatic scales like we know today, not a lot of connection. It's all made for very rhythmic. Right? So again, I don't play this one. All right? And when you get to something like this is also known as a toyo, right? Which is almost as tall as me. Not that I'm very tall, right? So this is more now becomes more like a percussion instrument. Once you get to the toe, you get very nice pitches, but when you get to the low, you get more of like a percussive effect. And that was exactly what they wanted. You want to notice that this music is actually very, very, very rhythmic, you know, and very simple harmonic. These are the winners.
Great, thank you. So we have some photos here. So you can see those two men there are playing the antara, which is the Quechua word for panpipe. And as Orlando mentioned, it comes in many different sizes. A picture of a quena. And then there are some instruments that the indigenous people adapted from Spanish instruments, which you referred to. So this is a folk harp. So if you've ever seen a European harp, it's enormous, right? It has all these pedals. They adapted it so it could be movable. So the folk harp became a really important part of indigenous music, even though it was adapted from the Spaniards. And sometimes they can walk around with it. They do come in different sizes. Some of them are a little bigger than this, but they're much more portable than the European harp, but they come from the European harp. The next one is a picture of a charango, which is an adaptation of the European guitar. It's quite a bit smaller, has a very different sound to it. So during the colonial period, which was when the Spaniards controlled everything from the 1530s to 1821, there was a real separation of music. So the indigenous traditions continued in the Andes, combined with some of these instruments they took and adapted from Europe. But on the coast, you had only European music that was being performed, and mostly sacred music. So you can see on the next picture. Here's a cathedral in Lima. You cannot imagine quenas and panpipes in here, right? So they built beautiful pipe organs, they trained choruses. So the music that was favored in the coast was European, particularly from the Baroque era. Those of you who are on music appreciation class know very well, by 1820, Europe was in the classical period with Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, but that music wasn't favored as much as the composers before that. They preferred the more ornate Baroque style, and that's the music you would have heard during the colonial time. So even after 1821, when you had independence, finally, from the Spaniards, this division of music continued. You had the indigenous music in the mountains, European, popular, and classical music on the coast. And this kind of matched the power structure where people in power, people in control, were Europeans, and the people who were beneath them were the mestizos, the combination of indigenous and European and the indigenous people. This began to change in the early 20th century when people all over Peru became really interested in indigenous culture and traditions. And a lot of classically trained Peruvian composers began to incorporate aspects from indigenous cultures indigenous rhythms, melodies into their compositions. Equally important, a lot of composers began to travel throughout various regions of Peru and write down the melodies and rhythms as a way of preserving them. So this is similar to what Bartók did in Europe. He wrote down a lot of the folk melodies in Hungary, where here you have composers like Holzmann and Sas, who are walking around, traveling throughout Peru, notating these different rhythms and melodies. So now we get to the musical part of this presentation, and we're going to be playing for you several pieces composed by Peruvian composers and one Peruvian American composers. And all were inspired in a variety of ways by melodies, rhythms, traditions, and instruments from indigenous music from the Andes. And so Orlando's going to talk a little bit about the first piece called Huiracocha.
Yeah, so Huiracocha is considered the main god, the main creationist god of the old Incan Empire, right? And this very 20th century piece that we're going to be listening to right now is based on, that inspiration, of the vastness creation of it, right? There is a very typical, very lyrical character to that in the beginning and at the end. And then in the middle, there is something much more rhythmical and much more lively, which is called the huayno rhythm, which is in the piano. And you're gonna notice that the melody is very modal, so it doesn't have all of the nice intricacies that we find in pop music today. It's mostly very much, has a large gaps in between the melody. So instead of having a direction towards a tonic, it's very floaty. It makes it really mirror the expansiveness, if you may, of being in a tall mountain and seeing a vast amount of land and a vast amount of hills. Sure, I have a packet if you want.
That's good. We'll
Okay,
good. It's better than the cathedral, I think. play two short piano pieces that also have a very direct indigenous influence. The first is called Preludio Incaico, which means Incan prelude, composed by Pablo Chávez Aguilar. He was actually a Catholic priest and wrote a lot of sacred music, but he was also really interested in indigenous music, and he set a set of 6 indigenous, or called Preludios Incaicos, to music. And they're all for piano. I am playing one of them. So it's a very lyrical piece with a pentatonic melody. So much indigenous music from the Andes has this 5-note scale rather than using the major or minor. So if I play a major scale, which all of you who are taking instrumental lessons have practiced, here is the pentatonic sound starting on the same note. So it has a very, very different quality to it. And a lot of indigenous melodies are pentatonic. So this particular melody you'll hear over and over and over again is a pentatonic melody. He also has these kind of harp-like effects that you hear throughout the piece, sort of reminiscent of the folk harp. The next piece is called Jirish Janka, which is Quechua, and it means white hummingbird. And this was composed by Rodolfo Holzmann, who was actually born in Germany, but came to Peru as a young man. And he was one of these composers who traveled around the country and wrote down melodies and rhythms. And so this little piano piece features dance rhythms, which are very vigorous, from the Ancash region, which is the north of Peru.
This one is a particularly interesting piece because it has a real mixture of this very, very distinct mixture of European traditions with Inca's tradition and all of this. So these two pieces are part of a larger three-movement work. We're going to skip the first one, we're going to play the second and the third one. And Sas, if I am correct, he did study in France, right? So what you hear in these two pieces is, first of all, this gorgeous lyrical movement like the Huiracocha that we played, but suddenly it bursts into these very chromatic, very advanced harmonic progressions, obviously things that he had learned back at the end of the century in France. And the third movement, it's a really interesting use of melody and rhythm, because we are used to hearing pop music, modern music, a lot of classical music in groups of 4 bars, in group of 8 bars, 2 bars, right? This one, the bar numbers are uneven. Some of them are 7 and 5, so a lot of prime numbers there, which give you that extra sensation of a real beginning, like is a stereotypical like pre-Colombian dance, right? Nothing that is very stylized, but no, something very, how can I say, ad hoc, something very improvised,
going to play is called Pregón y Danza by Enrique Iturriaga. So you can see from your programs he had a very nice long life. He lived to be 101 years old. And he was actually a student of Andrés Sas, who just played, and Rodolfo Holzmann. So it was this lineage that was going on there. Pregón, the title of the first movement, can loosely be translated as the street seller's cry or song. So from colonial times up until recently, these vendors would wander around the streets of Lima in the very early morning, singing these songs, and each identified a particular item they were selling. So if you would hear from the distance a particular tune, you knew it was someone selling chickens. If you heard another tune, you knew it was somebody selling eggs. And all these vendors were running around and walking around with these different tunes. So in this first movement, entitled Pregón, Iturriaga really captures the atmosphere of Lima, the darkness, the mist, and all these songs that are going on at the same time. And you also hear the sound of church bells at the very beginning. Pregón goes directly into danza, which means dance, and this is a very aggressive dance. And he definitely uses the piano as a percussion instrument. Gone is a nice melodic quality of the piano. It's really definitely a percussion instrument. Also, there's a fair amount of dissonance, so harsh sounds and harmony you would not be hearing with the previous composers that we featured. There are also two contemporary musical techniques I want to talk about. One is called changing meter. So instead of having the same number of beats per measure, they change it. So at the beginning of danza, you have 5 beats per measure, but then it switches to 6 and 5 and 3. Lots of syncopation. And then my favorite technique is called polyharmony, which you have 2 or more harmonies at the same time. Just to demonstrate that at the very end of this piece, we have these chords which sound fine together, right? They sound good, and this sounds good. Put them together, however, and you get this. So that kind of harsh sound, polyharmony, you'll hear throughout this particular piece. So I hope you enjoy Pregón y Danza.
20th century part of the program, more contemporary, more avant-garde. I'm going to play a piece by Celso Garrido-Lecca, which tries to mirror a little bit the, and I want to use this very, very gently, the not so stylized sounds that you can get. We call them impure, where there's a lot of air in it, you know, where there is a lot of bending, not so good intonation as we have in your typical classical music tradition. So Garrido-Lecca actually takes these sounds that he heard in the native flutes, you know, and he actually makes an entire piece out of that for the modern flute. And much like the piece that you just heard, there are very, very strong rhythmic elements to that. And again, what you call harmonies are also not as you would call chords, but they are based around a certain pitch. So instead of being so much of notes stuck together, it's that return to that same note over and over again, and then that center shifts so you're in a different key, as it may. There are different so extended techniques here. Sometimes you're going to hear me play two notes at the same time, you know, again, you know, with that impurity of sound in between. Sometimes I'm going to need to overblow some notes on purpose to get some pitches that are going to sound very glassy and very thin. And sometimes I'm just going to do some percussive sounds with the instrument without actually putting any air through the flute. And finally, the last one, which is very common now, but back then it was not, it's called flutter tone. If you do this, right, that's all, you know, and it makes this flutter in the sound of the flute.
we're going to play is by Gabriela Lena Frank, who is a Peruvian American composer. She still lives in the US. Prolific composer, many of her compositions are inspired by indigenous music from the Andes. The piece we're going to play is called Sueños de Chambi, which means Dreams of Chambi. The complete piece has 7 movements, each one representing or depicting a specific photograph by the indigenous photographer Martin Chambi. We're going to play the last 3. Just to give you an idea of Martin Chambi's style, so here we have a few photos here. Martin Chambi was the first indigenous photographer to become internationally recognized. Then he had a studio in Cusco from the 1920s to the 1950s, and he described and depicted everyday indigenous life. So unlike a lot of the foreign photographers who came and photographed the landscapes and people as if they were very exotic, Martin Chambi was part of their world, and so he had a very direct and sympathetic way of portraying everyday life, of portraying some sorrows, of portraying festivals. So here are a couple of photos. So this is a self-portrait of Chambi. So he's just there with his mule in the Andes. The one you saw before was an indigenous person with a quena, with the alpaca. The next one is great. This is Machu Picchu, which you might recognize. And there's another self-portrait of Chambi, kind of blending in with the landscape there of Machu Picchu. And then the next one is really quite beautiful. This is just a village, an indigenous village, and you can see the mist, you can see the smoke coming up from the chimneys. So he just describes everyday life in a very, very beautiful way. Today you can see some of his photographs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and they're all over in Europe. Of course, in his time, he wasn't famous at all. He was just known as an indigenous photographer who photographed everyday life. So as I mentioned, we're going to play 3 of these Sueños de Chambi. The first one that we're going to perform is called Adoración para Angelitos, which means adoration for little angels. And so we're actually going to show you the photographs later as we play. So I'm going to describe the piece and the photographs, and then you'll see them when we're playing. So the Adoración para Angelitos depicts a photograph by Chambi that he took of a dead child surrounded by mourners. And these dead children were often called angelitos, little angels. And this piece is for piano, this movement's for piano. And you'll hear this very plaintive melody, which is an actual indigenous lullaby. And it's harmonized by Gabriela Lena Frank in a very evocative, very chromatic way. This proceeds directly into Harawi de Chambi. A Harawi is a particular type of indigenous music, kind of like a lament, very melancholy. And you will see another self-portrait of Chambi. The last one is called Marinera, which is a coastal dance. And this is a very, very vigorous dance, lots of syncopation. It's even kind of jazzy. And at times it sounds like Orlando and I aren't really playing together, but it's okay because we end up together. So you don't have to worry. There is one technique, though, that I want to tell you about that she uses called chord clusters. So the groups of notes, you'll hear this kind of thing. So I'm not playing a bunch of wrong notes. Trust me, she really asked me to do that. So you can hear these chord clusters throughout. Now, we are extremely lucky that we have our illustrious voice professor here. She's going to gently sing you the lullaby upon which the first movement that we're going to perform is based. I'd ask you, please don't clap and cheer when she finishes singing, because we're going to go right into the piece. You can clap and cheer at the end of the piece for her. We'll let her sing, and then I'll play the piano part, and we'll show the photographs for the last 3 movements, okay?
In case some of you are wondering why everybody isn't clapping after all the songs, in classical music tradition, you wait till the end of the group to clap.
But we're happy if you clap, because that means you like it, and that's good.
Well, just so you know.